dollop of strawberry-colored cream adhered to her chin. She fished in her purse for her pocket mirror. Bending down with her ass pointed in Adam's direction, she held the mirror between her legs. With winter freezing Beijing and my love life, it's time to spice things up with a little feminist erotica and other personal research. And if there's anyone who inspires me to delve deep into my female sexuality, it's best-selling novelist Linda Jaivin. I can't wait to meet her this afternoon at the Bookworm. Linda not only made feminism sexy before anyone had heard of Sex and the City. She's an old China hand who's been writing about this country since the 80s. Now that's sexy.
Didn't you live here in China in the 80s before you wrote your best-selling book, Eat Me, and became the queen of feminist erotica?
I did live in China, so a lot of people were really surprised when my very first, book under my own name comes out, and it's not about China, but it's about fruit and sex and a few other things, yeah. So I wrote it before Sex and the City, but it was about 4 women, their friendship and their erotic encounters, and telling each other stories about sex and love and life. And I wrote it because I wanted to read erotica that had comedy, that had real people that I knew, people that would be, I could really be friends with if they were real people. And I didn't really find anything at the time. Now there's a lot more of that. This is also pre-chick lit, so pre-Bridget Jones, all of that sort of thing. And I really wrote it to amuse myself, but it's amused a lot of people, so I'm rather pleased. When I wrote it, I wrote the first few stories for myself and developed these characters. A friend read them and said, you should get them published. So they were published in a little magazine. At that time, a publisher approached me from Text Publishing in Melbourne, and he said, he'd been reading my essays and my China stuff, and he said, oh, do you have a book-length essay in you? And I said, well, I've got a pornographic novel in me. And he laughed. This is what I wanted to do. He'd humor me. So what happened was I wrote the book, and it was going to sell, it was going to have an imprint of 2,000. Before it even hit the shelves, there were orders for 6. It stayed on the bestseller list in Australia for 7 months, and I got a book deal in the States, and it was translated into 12 languages. It was all rather unexpected. And then suddenly I was an erotic writer, whereas previously I'd been a rather low-profile writer on Chinese culture. I first came to Beijing in 1980. I'd been in Taiwan from 1977 to 79. Then I moved to Hong Kong, and I started coming to the mainland. And that was just on the... Deng Xiaoping had pretty much just announced the open door for modernizations, the economic reforms, and things were just beginning to happen. So I remember when there was only the Beijing Hotel and the Qianmen Hotel for foreigners to stay in. I remember a time when you could not associate with Chinese without seriously endangering them. You certainly couldn't have relationships with Chinese, full-on, love, sex relationships without a risk of them going to labor reform. That's when I first came to China. That was the situation. There were no bars, where people could hang out and mingle. It was very different. There was a lot of excitement, though, because there was all this possibility, and nobody knew how far things could go, because every time things went a little bit further, a new movement came along. And 1983, anti-spiritual pollution. 1987, anti-bourgeois liberalization. So things would just begin to open up. There would be art exhibitions. People would be pushing in terms of what they could write about, what they could paint about, what they could sing about, the way they could sing, and so on, the way they could paint. And then, bam, along would come a movement, and everybody went like this, and a couple people, got dragged off, and the penalties got less and less and less. People got bolder and bolder and bolder. So it was a very exciting time, because what we were witnessing then was a whole cultural renaissance, a real rebirth. At the time there was a magazine called, I don't know, it probably still exists, China Reconstructs, which was the main government propaganda magazine for the outside world. This is what China is doing. And they were reconstructing, but also the people of China were reconstructing. And things were moving along in such an interesting way, and yet you really didn't know where it was going to go. So it was thrilling. Seeing what China has become now, I feel it was built on the foundation of everything I saw happen in the 80s. People fought for the freedoms they have now. They fought for them, they struggled for them, they worked behind the scenes, under the scenes, over the scenes, and going sort of straight at brick walls, you know, crashing into brick walls again and again until they actually broke through them to get to the situation that we see now.
There are some Chinese authors, you know, in the late 90s who were writing about this sexual revolution in China. Has there been a sexual revolution here?
Oh, completely, absolutely. It was so fraught in the past. I mean, people will always have sex if they can. That's just a given. And they were having sex in the Cultural Revolution. They were having sex in the countryside as sent down youth. You know, people were doing all sorts of things. But there was not a lot of information. And so in the early 80s, I remember all of these books. There were these books that would come out for newlyweds, of course, and they were about sex. And there were all these stories that would be in the papers, which were stories about people coming and saying, "I can't get pregnant. My wife, you know, my husband and I have been married for a year," and they discovered that they've actually been having anal sex all along. You think this sort of thing couldn't happen, but you know, complete lack of information. Also, there were a lot of stories in the newspapers in the early 80s. I'm talking Chinese newspapers about how, about modesty and about men wanting their wives to take off their clothes so they could see their bodies, and the wives not being willing to do that. So there's a lot of things around sexual modesty and information that from the beginning of the 80s has slowly come out, you know, and has helped the whole atmosphere of reform. The fact that now there are venues where you can freely meet people. The fact that now young people don't necessarily live with their parents or in a tiny little dorm room watched over by a very, very watchful you know, security division. All of this contributes to a loosening up.
How much do people assume that these characters are you?
They always assume these characters are me.
How much of them are you? I mean, you know, especially some of these relationships with Chinese men.
Well, I think I'm in every single one of my characters. I think that male, female, old, young, Chinese, Western, whatever they are, even in my latest novel, which is a Turkish-born small-time crim, you know, I am him. That's the magic of fiction. It's also the nice cloak of fiction too.
I mean,
but yeah.
When you first moved here, dating Chinese men was taboo.
Oh, it was very. You had to sneak around so much.
Did you do it anyway?
Of course I did.
So do you have any advice for a single girl in Beijing around dating?
Always do something slightly unexpected, because there's a certain idea, I think, which is common among a number of Chinese people, not everyone, of course, because China is such a diverse country, such a heterogeneous place. But there's some people you encounter who expect you to be one way or another because you're Western, and what you do is you subvert it. Don't be that way. Play with it. That's a good game. I know that some people will say, you know, oh, look at her, she's ugly, she's old, you know what I mean? And she's talking about sex. Like, I just know that's going to come up. So, you know, the thing is...
The haters.
Yeah, the haters, you know, and you just go, whatever.
This goes out to all the haters.
This goes out to all the haters, the sort of people who say, oh, what does she know about sex? She's old, she's ugly. You know, you're missing out if you don't know that it's personality.